I'm excited to be with Jennifer Hill today. She is a breath of fresh air also. So super excited to talk with Jennifer, kind of to take a tip from the actual session. And we'd love to just start by listening of sorts. And we'll love some folks to put in the chat what is either a question you have that you would like to get answered during the session, or what is a hope you have from this session. So just take a second, and to the point of intentionality that Caitlin shared, what's something that comes to mind as you think about this idea of listening leading to less work? So I'll just take about 30 seconds to let people put in the chat what you're hoping to learn or think about in the session. Oh, great. Yeah. How can intentional listening lead to better relationships? How do you develop effective listening skills and apply it during the appropriate times? Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Erica. How do you convince leaders that constructive feedback will lead to better decision making? Thank you. Jung, Whitney, that's a great question. Also, all three of those are great. Keep those going, coming with love to see, because that helps us also figure out how to tailor the conversation. Super helpful. So I'm excited to introduce you all to Jennifer Hill. Jennifer and I are going to talk through some of this. Sometimes listening, especially in, again, schools and districts and things are moving so fast, it can feel counterintuitive. And the idea that it can actually lead to less work is also counterintuitive as an idea and concept. And part of why I'm excited to bring Jennifer is because she has such a unique perspective, because she's worked in so many different arenas. So Jennifer is the mom of 2 teenagers, which I think requires a ton of listening. She's worked in the private sector at Shurion, and she's worked in schools. And now you're you lead policy and programming at Nashville Public Education Foundation. Can you tell us a little bit about what Nashville Public Education Foundation does?
Yeah, hi Shani, and welcome participants. I'm so happy. It's such a privilege to be with you guys today. At the Nashville Public Education Foundation, we really are looking to build schools where all kids thrive, and support schools and helping all kids thrive. And we really look at that through 2 lenses. We look at what we can do within schools and to develop school-based conditions where kids thrive. So that might be ambitious instruction, welcoming inclusive cultures, engaging educational experiences, those type of things. But then we also look at the context of the community and what we need to be dialoguing about within the community to be able to solve some of the inequities that we know were presented at schoolhouse doors. So we have programming that supports teachers and following their dreams for building schools that thrive. And then we also do some community-based work around creating a shared narrative about what it takes for kids to thrive in schools. And then also support the district in building their capacity to be responsive to families, teachers, parents, and the demands that are placed on them each day.
That's awesome. And you can hear this in how Jennifer described what the foundation does. But part of why I was so excited to bring Jennifer on is they've done so many different things, from listening tours, and lots of folks do listening tours, but I think how you all did it was really unique, putting forth reports. They have a teacherpreneur program where I got to be a judge, where they took teachers through a kind of a design process where teachers came up with ideas that they wanted to see, and they gave the teachers money to actually make the ideas come to life. I'm curious, so clearly at the heart of what you all do and how you all approach your work is listening. Why does it matter so much to you, and what do you think are the benefits, or what do you all get out of it in terms of listening?
Yeah, I mean, I think we get a lot. I think I was really intrigued by somebody's question about that it leads to better decision making. And I think that's very much what we believe at the foundation, is that you get better solutions when you listen well and deeply. And so we've done a lot of different activities. You mentioned several of them or programs that we've done, but I really want to highlight 3 that I think kind of encompass the way we try and listen within the community. We've done big, massive listening tours, as you mentioned, to understand what were the challenges with early literacy in our community. And when we approached that project, what we realized we needed to do was understand what was both present and missing in our community that could better support early literacy before our students got to the schoolhouse doors. We also do annual analysis looking at post-secondary attainment of our MNPS graduates, where we pair not only qualitative data, but also qualitative data. So really thinking about, like, when I look at this data, what are the stories that I need to be aware of that this data is trying to tell me? And then I think the third thing that we do is that we listen and look for experts that are hidden among the ecosystem. And that's really what I think about when we think about the Teacherpreneur program, right? Teachers are the experts of the contexts in which they exist. And how do we provide them time and space to be able to demonstrate that expertise and to explore that expertise beyond just instructing students on a daily basis.
I love that. That's, I mean, I'm clearly unbiased about Possip as the founder, but one of the things, some of the things that you talked about was what's missing, like you know, what's present and what's missing. And sometimes when we ask questions and when we try to listen, we all bring our own frame to it. And that's why having an open-ended way where people can share, so you can see, okay, what's present, what's missing. That's one thing. Hearing from the diverse experts in our community, so parents, teachers, students, and creating a system where we really can listen to all of those different constituencies. It doesn't have to be possible, but really truly thinking about how do you have a way to listen to them. And then a third thing that you mentioned was really multiple ways you all have of listening. So you talked about reports and data. You talked about kind of going out and having programming for that, and like having different experts in the ecosystem. So that's really neat. So you talked about listening, leading to better decision making. And this is one of the questions that someone put in the chat. How do you keep it from being overwhelming? And yeah, and how do you think about it? Is it overwhelming? And for school, you know, thinking about your time in schools in particular, like how do you keep it from being overwhelming?
Yeah, so I think that it depends on the purpose for listening, right? So I think sometimes, right? So I saw someone else in the very beginning of the chat mention like how listening can support relationships, right? And so sometimes listening is providing space and very intentionally building relationships, building trust, building those alliances and coalitions and collaborations that you need to do the work. Sometimes listening is for problem solving, right? So sometimes listening is for understanding. And so I think that each of those has expectations and requirements of us. And so sometimes it's about understanding what the purpose of listening is. I also think that sometimes we assume that what we're going to hear is something that needs to be fixed as well, right? And sometimes what we hear is not that we need to fix something, but it's really creating space for someone who can divest of something that they need to share with you in order to be able to move and continue through the process or continue the thing that they do best. And so I also think it's really interesting to think about whether or not listening always requires action or if listening actually is the action.
Wow. I'm gonna rewind and try to kind of like go back through because there's so much in there that really kind of provokes me. One is understanding what the purpose of listening is. And our previous session was about asking the right question. And so the thread, we had someone who does data and analytics for products at Procter & Gamble. And one of the things he was sharing is understanding the purpose of your question. So understanding the purpose of listening is super powerful. And and what you shared, where sometimes it's to build a relationship, sometimes it's to solve a problem, sometimes it's to create the space and let someone divest of something. And I think that's so important because in schools, I think by our nature, and I'm a former teacher, as educators, we probably do go to the fix it and to wanting to solve people's problems and to help people. Bringing these, yes. But we so often think we're going to have to do something with it. And so it makes the listening more burdensome for us because our assumption is whatever I get, I have to do something with. And we actually see this a lot with our partners, and we try to like help them understand, like sometimes it really is just creating the space so someone can share and that you can see it, like you can take it in, but that doesn't mean you need to do anything with it. Even just because you having a different perspective is doing something with it. You understanding what that person's perspective is doing something with it. And so really, I think about some of the questions that people had in terms of their hopes for this session. I think that idea for me, I'm walking away with is really thinking about what is my purpose for listening in this time. Is it to empathize? Is it to build relationship? Is it to create space? Or is it that we really do need to solve a problem? And I think that also connecting to our earlier morning session will also help you think about, well, what types of questions do I ask? Do I ask a question so people can just share whatever's on their mind? Or do I really need to make a decision? And therefore, I'm going to ask a very targeted question and close the world of what I can even intake. when you're getting a lot of inputs and information, how do you think about, organizing that, doing something with it? Yeah, how do you think about that?
That's really hard for me because I hoard inputs. I absolutely love the data, and I like to take things in and hold it and save it for the future. So that one's a really hard one for me. I think it goes back. I think it goes back to the purpose, right? Like, what am I, not what am I listening for, but why am I in community with the people that I'm currently in community with? And so so that then helps me understand what I need to do with what they're sharing with me, I think. I will say this is probably my weakest part of my listening skills, is actually knowing how to organize it, because I do so much enjoy the input and the relational piece, that I tend to lean into the relational and leaning purpose. And so I just gather information and for when I might be able to use it again. So
Okay, so then
probably not very good answer for anyone.
So then I'm curious on a few other ones. So then what is it about when you say you like to hoard information and data, like what do you do with it?
Yeah. I think that what I do is I try and make connections. So I feel very comfortable in the forest and the trees. And so for me, the forest is really about my relational work. The trees is about my relational work, and how that informs how I see the forest. And so I'm looking to connect dots for folks. I'm looking to network, connect other people to other people who can be better resources, all different types of things. But for me, it's about those connections.
Well, I think that's super powerful, because I think that's actually connected to adaptive leadership. And you might remember, what's the other type of leadership? There's adaptive and there's another kind. Someone might know it in the chat. There's a book in education that talks about this a lot, but adaptive leadership is this idea that you don't necessarily have to have the answer all the time. Being able to get an input or information and not feel like you have to use it immediately is actually like a really adaptive kind of leadership idea, because you're like, I'm going to take this input, I'm going to take this idea, and I might do something with it in the future, but I don't have to do something with it immediately. And that's a hard thing to do. Especially, again, as educators, our job is often to be experts, to teach, to kind of share what we know, or at least that's how we kind of perceive our jobs. And so the idea that I'm going to ask a question and not respond, or not like have to do something with it immediately, is really interesting. So one of the things you talked about is that not having to respond. So how do you keep yourself from responding or having an answer to someone when you're listening, and someone put in the chat they hope to have like better listening skills? How do you think about responding to people, or like even sitting in the conversation or taking in information when you don't have an answer?
I think that for me is just being an empathetic human, right? And really understanding that first of all, I don't need to be all things to all people. And I cannot be, so I can't be any things for all people. And I think it's also about being present and bearing witness sometimes, right? So sometimes the path, the path is always through, right? So I don't think there's no shortcuts or side steps for the process that people need to go through to be their full selves, right? And so I think I just, over time, and probably with a lot of therapy, that's not a different conversation, and just comfortable sitting with people and not having to be the person who has to come up with an answer. And I think that and I'm comfortable also telling folks that, hey, listen, like, I need think time, I need process time, in order for me to be my best self for you, or to meet the need that you have. I need to be able to take and consider what you've just presented with me. So I think, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah,
helpful.
Yeah, and there's a great follow-up question in the chat from Ante. Do you think there are moments and seasons to share what we know and other times not to share? And how do you think about when to share what you know versus not?
Yeah. Yes, I think that there absolutely are seasons for sharing and not to share. And what I think what I do is really think about, is what I have to share actually going to move the issue forward? Is it actually a solution? And is the group or the participant that I'm working with actually in a position to even receive anything, right? So, I mean, listening is a relational thing, right? It doesn't happen truly in isolation, right? So it's really tapping into your other senses of what's going on with the situation, and leaning into intuition, I think. And this might get a little
Yeah.
bit too woo-woo, but I lean in and am guided often by intuition. Um,
Something that's interesting, something I think about often, and I try to tell myself this is, am I more concerned with what I want to say or what I want to see happen? And
mhm.
sometimes when I'm wanting to share, it's because I have something I want to say, but it may not, to your point, actually improve the outcome that I'm looking for. And so I just have to try to check myself. I do it probably better in my professional life than my personal life, which is focusing on what I want to
100%.
see happen versus what I want to say.
Yeah.
So as you know, it is our theory that listening can lead to less work or less painful work. So how have you seen this play out?
Yeah, I think the way that I've seen it lead to less work is being really intentional in building cultures and systems that support listening, right? And so that thinking about if you're working with a team, what are the most important aspects that of input or feedback that I can get from this team, or what are the spaces where I need to create those in order for us to work most efficiently. So that's one way. I think the other way is just acknowledging that not everything that is seen or heard actually always needs an action, kind of going back to something we already talked about. Sometimes listening is the action that's required, and the presence in the moment is what is required more than a follow-up or something like that. I also think that there is an efficiency that can be gained in listening. And particularly if you're taking in multiple points of view or talking to different stakeholders, right? You'll be able to sense themes and save yourself a lot of time, right? So I think about sometimes the report that we produce on post-secondary outcomes. If I looked at that solely without gathering any qualitative analysis or talking to folks on the ground, I might think I needed to fix 7 things. When in reality, if I doubled down on 2, because that's what folks on the ground say are the real barriers, then I've saved myself a lot of work.
That's awesome. In our previous session, that came up too about asking the right questions, which is one of our panels was talking about, a couple of panels were talking about how many assumptions you make. And so you create all these solutions based on assumptions. And oftentimes then you create additional work because you created something that you thought was solving a problem that wasn't. And sometimes it's creating more problems.
I think that happens in education and in policy and systems all the time.
Yeah. It's like great intentions, well-meaning. And we saw this interestingly through our pulse checks. We saw it during the pandemic and this came in early on, and this was the power of listening, and not only listening, but like you said, looking at the data through different lenses, where there was a narrative early in the pandemic that everyone wanted to go back to school. And then districts were trying to make decisions about that. Then once they did pulse checks with their communities and looked at the data, they saw that the answer to that question looked very different depending on the demographics of the community. Then something else interesting that came out was there was assumption, well, parents would feel more comfortable returning to in-person schools. There were face masks, but then the data showed that actually the people who wanted to return to in-person school also did not want to wear face masks. So there are all of these things that like you can actually, it doesn't necessarily make the decision. It can make the decision making a little easier, but it can also contextualize your communication. So sometimes you can't change the decision or change the outcome, but then at least you know who you're trying to convince and what and why. And so those are some of the things I share that I think it helps cut through the noise. It can decrease your stress by what you're worrying about. We both as humans have narratives that we tell ourselves, but organizations have narratives that they tell themselves. And part of what we see through pulse checks too, so often schools we're used to being beat up in education. Like that's just the reality. And so often the narratives we're telling ourselves are negative. And so by listening, you can actually hear that all parents aren't angry at you, all kids aren't, there are kids who love school, there are parents who love their child's teacher. It happens a lot, but I think because we're so used to kind of being in action, we miss those opportunities too, to hear some of the positive. And then also seeing what rises to the top. Sometimes what's top of mind for us because we can see it, it's different from what's top of mind from other folks that are in the trenches and in the field. And so, yeah, it helps us to kind of decrease our blind spots as well.
I really like that
Mhm.
point that you made right there, because it makes me think about something that I didn't know really how to communicate. And I think what you just said about COVID is really important. You know, building, and I'm going to lean into a little bit of the systems, both the informal and formal systems that we set up, because sometimes people don't actually know what they want. Which is why I also think sometimes there is a benefit to not taking immediate action. Um, and let me give you an example. I hear people wanting to go back to school in the COVID times as is I want something normal. I want something predictable, right? And so how does that change when we ask additional questions about what it would be comfortable, what else would happen, right? We get a little bit more precise, a little bit more information, a little bit more surgical about what would need to be in place to have certain families or certain populations or certain communities return to our schools. And I think that that's just one of the benefits of having those regular systems or feedbacks in place is that we really are able to get into deeper conversation and really begin to understand what people are saying about what their actual needs are or what assistance they may actually require.
I love that. Yeah. And also just kind of the first listening is not um, uh, the first time of listening creates a space for more questions and for more learning as well. So I know we're running short on time. This goes by so fast. So I want to see, I know we already talked through the question from Ante. Are there other questions that folks have as we kind of we close out in our last couple of minutes? All right, so Erica has one. How do you merge listening and equity? I love that. In other words, what strategy do you use to bring those that are often hesitant to speak?
Yeah. I will say this is a development area for us as an organization, and then I think also, you know, me personally, I'm not valuing the perspective and bringing the equity, but actually building the trust and being building the trust to be able to be in those conversations. So we definitely, I personally feel like that, you know, it's such a cliche, but like, you know, uh, not for us without us is really, really important to me. And I think that that's really where this kind of stems, where this kind of stems from. So that I don't try to make policy without talking to individual people on the ground about what that policy and impact would be. And not just that, but like really saying like what would make the difference for you or for your community if we were able to do things, and those type of solutions that are so much more authentic and beneficial to community. So I don't have a really great answer here other than it's highly valued and I'm trying to get better at it.
That's great. I have a couple of thoughts to Erica's question, and there's another great question in the chat. I think there are a couple of things. One is focus on who is sharing. What I see so often is in education, we focus so much on the deficit. So like, let's say you're in a school and there's a parent or three parents who constantly share, highlighting and elevating that so that other parents see that as a role model and start to say, oh, they are listening. And so I think that's one thing is like taking who is sharing and who you're listening to and elevating that. The other thing is scaffolding questions. We saw this early on. So as an example, we were working with one school and we were asking parents like, oh, what teacher do you want to shout out? And we were getting pretty low response rates. And so then we're like, well, let's scaffold questions and get to the, do you know your child's teacher's name? So I think kind of starting at an access point that everyone can try to kind of think, okay, if that's not working, what's the point of access where folks can contribute? And then that gets to the third thing, which is what information do parents have? And so that's the other thing that we've seen that's been different between schools, which is some schools parents don't have a lot of information, so it's really hard for them to share feedback. And so making sure that in the lens of equity, we're also giving information to people so that they have enough information to be able to contribute back is really important. And then, sorry to go so fast, I just know we're at time. So the question around the question is, some leaders are reluctant to receive negativity when there's already so much. How do you assure them? Jennifer, I'll have you answer that, and I'll share a follow-up and close out with a quick slide.
Yeah, so I think that there is an assumption that if a parent wants to reach out, that there may be negativity there. So, and that's a lot of the case, right? I mean, some of us are happy consumers, like I think that when I think about how do I assure them, I would say the negativity goes somewhere. And so, like, let's harness it, right? Like, because it's going to show up, unfortunately, somewhere. I think that that's just the reality of school context. If someone is feeling uncomfortable, if someone is not having a positive experience, most folks are not able to hold that in and contain it. And so the question is I think, not how do we assure leaders that it's okay, but how do we support leaders in navigating difficult conversations? How do we create more spaces where it becomes not risky to receive those criticisms potentially, or to receive maybe a piece of something that may be perceived as negativity, and kind of flip that around into something that is doesn't become toxic, I guess. Because I think I have a point of view that negativity left to simmer almost always becomes something very toxic and more pervasive.
Yeah, they are so tired. I think the other thing is to balance it out, so that to bring in opportunities, because there are some happy people, but if the systems don't exist to hear from everyone, you only hear from the people who are like riled up enough to kind of come, and they typically tend to be more negative. So that's the other thing, to make sure you have balancing systems so that you can hear the positive as well. But it's definitely a reality. And then yeah, it's just that I think that's hard and challenging as well. But also to normalize that, like, it is overwhelming to hear, especially if you're only hearing negativity, and to also create some space from seeing it as connected to their identity. Like every kind of, I remember this is, I was working with a friend who was like very stressed out during the pandemic because they had bus drivers who couldn't drive, and as you all know, and just to remind them, this is a national shortage. Like, this is not because you are a bad leader that, bus drivers have COVID and are out sick. So I think those are some of the things to also do. Jasmine, are you able to share the screen real quick? I know some folks, if you have to hop, please do. I'm going to share a few kind of quick tips for using listening. One is making sure you're asking great questions, similar to what Jennifer was sharing. Know what the purpose is for the questions, and know what the purpose is for listening. More questions, less answers. That's just the idea that Jennifer was talking about also, which is when someone shares something, you don't have to necessarily always answer it. Sometimes you can ask a follow-up question just to deepen your understanding. And so that can actually lead to more context and perspective, and not feeling like you have to go into action all the time. The third is thinking best case scenario. So often we have scripts where we think about what's the worst case scenario. Like, if we ask the question, it's going to be negative, or like we're going to have bad things to say. Think about what what's the best case scenario, which is that they could say really great things. And so that helps you kind of open up the idea to listening. Listen in different ways. So sometimes, to the question about negativity also, sometimes you're not in the space where you can hear qualitative because it might be overwhelming, but is there quantitative data or a way that you can close in the question? So you're still listening, but you're doing it in a way that's digestible for you in that moment. Using what you learn and communicating that back out. We'll have a session on telling your impact story, but as you're learning things, narrating back for those you're listening to, how you're listening to them and what's happening because of it, will help them invest them in the decisions that are being made. And then finally, consider the risk of not listening. I do think we often think about the pressure and pain of not listening, but I think the point you just made, Jennifer, is really important, which is the negativity is going to show up somewhere because people typically have a hard time keeping it in. So how can you harness it and direct it in a way that is helpful for you? The last thing that might be helpful as a tool, if you go to the next slide, is some of you may have heard about this. You should go and look it up. It's one of my favorite concepts, is this idea of the Thehari window, which is there are things, there are things that you know, and then there are other people and the things that they know and they see. And so where you want to really get in as much as you can is into the upper left corner of the arena, which are where both you have the same information as the folks who are around you. And so the known to self and the known to others, and listening and sharing are the two things that allow that to happen. And so otherwise you may have blind spots you don't know about. You may have people around you, the assets that you talked about, the experts, and they might have things that they know, but the more you're able to listen and to share, then it can all have that upper left quadrant. You can go on Google and Google Thehari window. I know probably lots of our folks who are in the SEL space and engagement space already know about this, but it's always a good reminder for me and a great tool and framework that you can share with your teams as you're trying to encourage listening and vulnerability in a way. So I think, is that it for us? Jasmine will put in the chat. We've got more sessions today. The next one I think is on, telling your story of impact, particularly if you have team members who are working on student recruitment or staff recruitment. This is something that can be really helpful. And then also in just narrating kind of the positivity that's happening in your community. So that'll be at noon. Jennifer's amazing, as you all can see. So thank you, Jennifer, so much for sharing. Also, if you all have a education foundation in your area and they're kind of looking to learn at what the Nashville Public Education Foundation does here is really great. So thanks so much, you all, and have a great rest of the day.